On the 24th of August 2001, 306 people, including 13 crew members, boarded an on-the-air transit flight, an Airbus A330-236 from Toronto to Lisbon. However, what they believed it would be routine. Flight would soon turn into a nightmare. As in the dark of night, they were awakened by the most shocking surprise. This is the tale of air travel. Flight 236 ran out of fuel over the Atlantic Ocean. It's a story of how two courageous pilots took control of an unlikely circumstance and saved the lives of hundreds of people, but it was interesting that it could have been avoided in the first place. So what took place on transit flight 236 the day of the incident was just like any the Pearson Airport in Toronto was recently 293 passengers from Canada were attempting to take the 7-hour evening flight. Transit flight to the Herto Delgado Airport in Lisbon, Portugal. A large number of the passengers were headed for their summer vacation in Europe, while the others were Portuguese expatriates returning to their home country. There were no suspicions from any portion of the passengers concerning the state of the Airbus A330 aircraft. They were boarding the plane as it was relatively new and also had a very good safety record, and even if it didn't, it was unlikely that anyone boarding the plane was thinking about anything other than getting to their destination. At that point, the captain of the flight was 48-year-old Robert Peach, who had amassed over 16,000 hours of flight experience. He was joined in by a variety of aircraft in the cockpit by 28-year-old Dirk Diego, who had approximately 5,000 flight hours expertise, and both pilots had no major incident previously while flying on an Airbus A330 at around 900. Flight 2:36 p.m. Local time, it was time for the flight to take off, and it was expected that the flight would take 7 hours, more or less. However, unbeknown to anyone aboard Flight 236 of the air transit, something very wrong was about to happen. With everyone on board, the plane taxied off the runway and took to the skies at a cruising altitude of 39,000 feet. The first few hours of the flight were largely uneventful, as nothing out of the ordinary occurred, and everyone was still expecting to smoothly arrive at Lisbon the next morning. Flight 236 was a long-haul flight, so if all seemed well, then the pilots wouldn't have too much to do, aside procedures like monitoring the aircraft systems and providing positional reports to flight control, amongst other things. After a routine first 4 hours, there was the first sign of concern at just after 5 a.m. UTC. With the flight crossing the ocean halfway, the pilots got the first unusual reading. According to their onboard computers, engine number 2, the engine on the right-hand side of the aircraft, had a difficulty with the engine's oil pressure. The engine was high, but the engine oil temperature and quantity were low. This combination of readings are uncommon in flights, as oil temperature tends to rise when flying. So the crew relayed the information to the dispatch for some feedback. Just over 30 minutes later, the cockpit central display, or ECOM, suddenly indicated a fuel imbalance between the engines on the wings. Right on the left are the aircraft and its engines. While this wasn't ideal, it was no immediate cause for concern, as the pilot could just open the cross-feed valve to permit the flow of fuel from the left wing to the right one. And this is what the pilots did, but they did their best. The ECOM continued to show a fuel imbalance, but this time the computers on board indicated that the fuel left in the jet had dropped below the required level. In obtaining this data, the pilots signaled to air traffic control that they were going to make a diversion to Leiras Airport and Azores Islands off the coast of Portugal. Initially, both pilots doubted the warning signals and concluded that the sensors had become faulty, and this was not something uncommon to view pilots negatively. Data generated by faulty sensors are not uncommon aircraft, such as the A330. So despite these indicators being a signal for a possible fuel leak, the pilots instead chose to treat it as an electronic error. But at this point, the readers were indicating that there were only about 7 tons of fuel left in the engines. This meant the aircraft's tank was only about 6% full, while it was almost halfway away from its destination. At this rate, they would have run out of fuel over the ocean. Because fuel leaks of this magnitude are so rare, neither pilot had received adequate instruction on how to locate them and address them, so they had to work with what was available. Checklists. What the checklists couldn't tell them was that a vibrating hydraulic rope had passed through the pipe before it burst. the outer casing of a fuel pipe causing fuel to leak heavily out of the engines. At this point, the aircraft had been losing fuel at an alarming rate, so the pilots attempted to keep track of the fuel rate. When they confirmed a loss in each tank the level at which the right engine was fuel leakage, they made the decision to reverse the cross-feed process, so the fuel from the right side tank was now being used to feed both engines. By now, the aircraft had fewer than 5 tons of fuel on board, which was less than 30% of the fuel they needed to get to their destination. Desperate, they called the Air Transit Air Traffic Control Center once more to inform them of the concerning circumstance. The pilots finally began to ponder executing a few leak procedures that would have necessitated that the aircraft descend by almost 20,000 feet. However, the captain, Robert Pett, felt like there was no time. Of fuel at 20,000 feet could be fatal during the landing process, as it wouldn't leave them enough time to glide through to the ground in case of total power failure. But after the red engine finally ran out of fuel and shut down, the aircraft could no longer sustain its 39,000 feet in elevation and had to start descending with only 600 kilograms of fuel left in the tank. The aircraft was still 240 kilometers from the airport. That is closest, a difficult situation was turning into an improbable, and the pilots are right now realized the nature of the threat they faced and declared an emergency to air traffic control after 13 minutes of improvisation and hoped the fuel in the left-hand engine also ran out. They were still over 100 kilometers away from their destination, and aircraft had now lost electrical power. However, the ram air turbine was quickly deployed from the fuselage to generate some electrical power to run some of the vital aircraft systems. But the final destination remains dozens of kilometers away. The captain had only one option to stretch, so that he can descend glide as long as possible, can land in the safest manner possible. However, this was a very difficult task, and the captain had to instruct the flight attendants to prepare the passengers for the possibility of a ditching of the aircraft. The passengers, who at this time had gone silent with fear, were now being told to get prepared for a dumping in the water as they fled of oxygen in the cabin. The captain knew he had to still try to get to the airport, as he was not about to give up on the lives of the hundreds of passengers in his plane. But with the aircraft at an altitude of around 30,000 feet and dropping at a rate of 2,000 feet per minute, he had only 15 minutes to find a solution before they hit the ground. It was a race against the clock at this point. The aircraft had lost 2 out of its 3 hydraulic systems, as well as its wing spoilers and the thrust reversers on the engines, making it becoming more challenging for the captain to control its movement so that it can continue. The aircraft will remain in the air as long as it's possible that the captain sank at a speed between the recommended glide speed and the stall warning speed as the aircraft descended. There were a few more issues Captain Pett had to deal with, like keeping his speed above 140 knots. So the ram air turbine would continue generating electricity, but at the same time, he could only go 200 miles per hour. Knots, or the landing gear, wouldn't extend as it was gliding. The only way he could direct the vehicle's movement aircraft was by pitching the nose up or down, which was extremely difficult. Finally, as Flight 236 approached the captain's efforts to Lajas Airport keep the plane in the sky were successful. But there was one big problem: the plane had remained too high with the airport runway. Now only 8 meters away, the captain found his plane still suspended at an altitude 13,000 feet, which was a figure nearly 455% higher than it should have been. Once again, the captain was now faced with 2 solutions: descend steeply towards the runway, or create some more distance so as to buy the plane more time to glide safely down. He obviously chose the latter, and he began a 360-degree turn to lose some altitude. After 2 minutes, the airport was back in view, but the plane was still too high. However, it wasn't high enough to complete another 360-degree turn, so the captain decided to begin a series of friction. The aircraft was moving extremely quickly and without a key components working, and it continued to skid uncontrollably down the runway. Even though the captain applied the brakes as hard as possible, the aircraft continued its skidding motion until all its tires worn down to the rims at around 6:54 a.m. UTC. The aircraft finally came to a halt on the LA airport runway. All 306 people on board were safe, with a few sustaining minor injuries. and the captain ordered a successful evacuation of all passengers and crew members. Within 90 seconds of the evacuation, fires had started on the left main gear wheels. Although these were promptly extinguished by the firefighters on ground, what threatened to be a terrible event had almost miraculously been avoided, thanks to the courageous efforts of the pilots. Shockingly, investigations would show that this all could have been easily avoided. Any subsequent inquiries into the crash landing revealed that an engineer had replaced a part of the aircraft's engine with one that was intended for a different aircraft. This was what caused a hydraulic line to come into contact with the fuel tube and causing it to rupture on Flight 236. While the final report said that the pilot's failure to recognize and relate information about the fuel leak in time contributed to the aircraft running out of fuel, it also praised them for their handling of the situation once the engines had failed, as Airbus's reaction to this incident introduced a new warning into their flight management computer, which notifies pilots if there's a high rate of fuel loss, suggesting a few leaks air. Additionally, Transit provided its pilots with additional instruction in long-range shooting operations and fuel administration and diversion procedures. They also changed their flight number out of there from TA-2362, flights from Toronto to Lisbon TS-480, and they now primarily employ an Airbus LR fleet rather than the previous model, a 330RS. Surprisingly enough, the affected A330 aircraft continued to fly for air transit until the pandemic hit in March 2020. In an effort to save the aircraft impending doom, Captain Pace unknowingly broke the record for the longest unpowered glide of a passenger aircraft. And with the enhancements to safety made in the aircraft that followed, it probably means that the glide is likely to remain a record for a very long time. So what do you think about the story of air transportation Flight 236? Argue that both pilots were wrong to doubt the interpretations that the cockpit computers. It's important to recognize that the figures have been seeing were quite simply too bonkers to be believable. Besides, the key takeout here should be their heroics after they realized they had been wrong. The pilots showed both unwavering bravery and inventiveness to save the lives of hundreds of individuals, and also affected some much change in the aviation sector.